Hi, good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about how the British East India Company approached the Mughal Emperor to get trading privileges for the East India Company to trade in India and how successful they were in getting the trade privileges. So the British East India Company, they got a charter, they got a license, they got a order or the right from the British Queen Elizabeth I to be the only company from Britain to be able to trade in a region called the East Indies. The East Indies consisted of the present day region of the Indian subcontinent, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, all those islands. This meant that they could do duty free trade from Britain for the six voyages that the East India Company were to carry out in the future, and also had the monopoly of trade for 15 years. The company could also acquire territory in East Indies, govern it, and also protect itself by having a private army. Once they got the charter to trade in the East Indies on 13th February 1601, the British East India Company set sail from Britain. They started with a fleet of 4 ships, and they reached a region in the Spice Islands called Aceh. There they met the king of the region called the Sultan and negotiated to trade in spices. They carried out the trade, and later they found a large Portuguese merchant ship. Some of the crew members of the British East India Company spied on this merchant ship of the Portuguese, also called a carrack, and they took away some of the spices from there. They came back to the English waters on June 1603 to the south of London. The fleet of 4 carried with them 900 tons of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves. Much of it was taken from the Portuguese merchant ship. Along with it were also spices that were brought from a region in the Spice Island called Aceh. The British East India Company sold these spices and made a profit of 300%. Though the British East India Company made a high profit, it was not the British but the Dutch who were superior in the Spice Islands. Spices were in high demand in Europe, and hence they were very profitable trading items. And these spices were found in the Spice Islands to the east of Indonesia. These islands were collectively called Moluccas. I told you that the Dutch were superior in these Spice Islands. They were superior because they had a better financing for their company, the Dutch East India Company, and they also had better arms than the British East India Company. One of the captains of the British East India Company would say that if the Dutch were to maintain their superiority, they would lay claim to the entire East Indies. The British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, both these companies fought many battles. On one occasion, on 1603, the Dutch East India Company, also known as VOC, had attacked this trading station of the British East India Company in a region called Ambiona in Moluccas, the Spice Islands in the east of Indonesia, and killed 10 British officials. There were many other battles later on, but more often than not, it was the British East India Company that had come on the losing side. Seeing these state of affairs, the British East India Company decided that they would leave the lucrative trade in the Spice Islands and look elsewhere. They then decided to look at a less competitive sector but a potentially emerging sector in Asia. That is the trade in cotton textiles, indigo, and chintz. Chintz is a shiny cotton cloth which has a printed design, usually of flowers, used in making curtains or covering furniture. The source of all these 3 luxuries was India. That is the point when the British East India Company for the first time looked towards India. I had told you that the first fleet of ships of the British East India Company had started in 1601. But it was during the third voyage that a fleet of ships had reached the west coast of India to Surat on 28th August 1608. These fleet of ships were commanded by a sea captain called William Hawkins. So he is the first commander of the British East India Company to have set foot on the Indian soil. During that time, India had a population of 150 million. And India also had a share of a one-fourth in the world trade of manufacturing goods. India was one of the top world leaders in the production of manufactured goods, especially cotton textiles. In fact, the cotton textiles of India were so popular that Mexico at that time had to go through deindustrialization due to the import of cheap cloth from India. Britain, on other hand, was trying to come out of a relatively impoverished agricultural society and only contributed a little less than 3% in the world trade of manufacturing goods. The majority of the 3% profits that it was making would find its way in the coffers of the Mughal emperor in Agra. For instance, between 1586 to 1605, there was 18 metric tons of silver that moved from Britain to the Mughal heartlands in exchange for Indian commodities. Because India had a high share of world trade in manufacturing goods, the Mughal emperor of that time was the richest in the world. The Mughal emperors wore luxurious silks which were dripping with jewels. They were actually the living embodiment of wealth and power. And that is the reason why, even today, the opulence of the Mughal Empire is manifested in the word Mughal, a business moguls, Mughal. So I've already mentioned that on 28th August 1608, the British East India Company had reached India. Like many other European nations which had gone to other lands to trade, they could have attacked the native population and could have got control of the land so that they could trade in the raw materials that they wanted. For example, in the 1520s, the Spanish they went to a region in present-day central Mexico, which was ruled by an empire called the Aztec Empire. It swept away the large armies of this empire and took control of the land. And similarly, the Dutch have also gone to the Spice Island called the Moluccas and killed the inhabitants there, burned the cities, and seized the ports. It was a way to control the region so that they could control the trade of the region. In a region in Spice Islands called Lontour, 800 of the inhabitants were deported to work in certain new plantations in a region of Indonesia called Java. The British East India Company, like some of these European nations, could have attacked India to control the trade from that region. But the British East India Company were aware of the strength and the power of the Mughal armies, and they decided not to attack the Mughal heartland but rather take the route of diplomacy. The Mughal Empire had 400,000 troops in arms. To get a flavor of what this meant, I would like to take you forward a little bit forward to 1602. In 1602, the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan had known that the Portuguese were making illegal fortifications and luxurious dwellings in a region called Hooghly in Bengal. The Portuguese were also forcibly converting the inhabitants, and this was against the rules of the Mughal government. When Shah Jahan got to know about this, he ordered the Mughal troops to attack Hooghly and expel the Portuguese from the region. Within a matter of days, the place came under the control of the Mughal armies and the Portuguese were expelled. Some of the Portuguese were escaping through the river Ganga. The army captured some 400 of these inhabitants and took them to Agra so that they could beg the emperor for mercy. Some of these Portuguese have refused to do this, and they were either made slaves or imprisoned. Majority of these Portuguese died, and there was nothing that the Portuguese governor in Goa could do about this. So this way, having reached Surat on 28th August 1608, the commander of the British East India Company, William Hawkins, reached Agra, where the emperor lived, reached the palace of the emperor 1 year later on 1609. He went there dressed as an Afghan nobleman and also got an opportunity to converse with the emperor, and he conversed in Turkish because it was the native language of the first Mughal ruler Babur, and hence the emperor at that time, Jahangir, knew some Turkish. The Emperor Jahangir was not so impressed with the commander, William Hawkins, and nothing much was achieved in terms of getting privileges or a piece of land to set up factory in Surat. William Hawkins leaves Agra 2 years later and is also gifted an Armenian woman by the emperor. Since nothing was achieved with regard to getting trade privileges from the Mughal emperor, the British East India Company were successful in convincing the King of Britain, King James, to send a royal representative, also called a royal envoy. The ambassador chosen for this purpose was a courtier of the king, MP, and a diplomat, and his name was Thomas Roe. He is known as Sir Thomas Roe. Sir Thomas Roe reached the palace of Emperor Jahangir in Ajmer in 1615. He reaches the palace of the emperor with some presents, and these presents were certain breeds of hunting dogs like the English Mastiff, the Irish Greyhound, some crates of red wine which Thomas Roe knew that the emperor was fond of, some paintings, and an English coach. A coach is a kind of a wagon that is driven by a horse, a wagon consisting of wheels. Subsequently, Sir Thomas Roe gets an opportunity to have interviews with the emperor. Sir Thomas Roe decided to touch the topic of the trade deal with the emperor immediately. But the emperor was not interested in trade and commerce. There were many conversations between Jahangir and Thomas Roe in the subsequent months. In all these conversations, whenever Thomas Roe brought up the subject of trade privileges to be given to the British East India Company, Jahangir would be intent on putting off such workday matters to some other day or some other time. The trade privileges that Sir Thomas Roe expected from the emperor was that the British East India Company would get a piece of land on which they could set up a trading station and also build residences so that they could trade, and they can do this trade under the protection of the empire in peace. Thomas Roe also expected some concessions to be given to carry out such a trade. These were called trade privileges. But Jahangir, as I said, was not interested in talking about trade and commerce, but he was rather interested to know the distant island that Sir Thomas Roe had come from. Thomas Roe would tell Jahangir that there are many priceless rarities in his land, that is England, and there were many merchants who would come to the land to collect these rarities. Thomas Roe would further say that such priceless rarities and curiosities could be brought to the emperor if the emperor provided the British East India Company the trading privileges. Jahangir would inquire if those rarities and curiosities were jewels or rich stones. Thomas Roe would then tell Jahangir that jewels and stones were to be found in the Mughal emperor, but it would be some other priceless gifts. According to what Thomas Roe had written, it is known that Jahangir had desired an English horse. Jahangir would further continue and ask Thomas Roe what he drank and how many times he drank. Is it possible to make a beer in the palace? This was the kind of conversations that Jahangir was having with Sir Thomas Roe, and it had nothing to do with trade and commerce. Further, there were some events which were also not related to trade and commerce. On one occasion, Sir Thomas Roe showed a miniature that was painted by one of the girlfriends of Sir Thomas Roe. Jahangir was impressed by that miniature and also got a copy of that miniature made and shows it to Thomas Roe and tells him that he could not make out the difference between the original and the copied miniature. Yet, in another occasion, it was about the English coach that Sir Thomas Roe had bought for Jahangir as a present. Jahangir was also impressed by this coach and also makes it a point to get the interior covered with a Mughal cloth of gold. Not only this, he also orders that a replica of this coach be made, and this replica was made so that his wife Nur Jahan could use it. This replica was also made within around a week. Judging by the conversations and the events that had transpired between Sir Thomas Roe and Jahangir, it is evident that Jahangir did not talk about trade and commerce despite a repeated request from Thomas Roe so that the British East India Company could get their trade privileges. Sir Thomas Roe was made to wait to get these privileges. Not only this, but the Mughals also never cared too much for the English. And this is evident from some of the events. On one occasion, when the embassy from England had come to the palace and were accommodated in 4 rooms, Thomas Roe had written that they were given rooms which had no windows, and the number of rooms given to accommodate the entire embassy was low. Thomas Roe was also humiliated by the fact that the Portuguese embassy had brought pearls and jewels to give the emperor, much more expensive gifts than the English commodities. The Mughal disregard for the English can be further illustrated by 2 more events. The first event is that the court painter of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, called Bichitra, had made a miniature painting of the emperor. The King of England, King James, was placed at a position below the feet of the emperor. Emperor was sitting and the King James was placed in a position below the seat of the emperor, just above the self-portrait of the painter or the artist Bichitra himself. The King James was painted as having worn a hat consisting of a few jewels and a silver white jacket over his body. The King James was looking annoyed with his low position in the Mughal hierarchy. Not only this, Jahangir used to write voluminous diaries, but there is not one instance in which he mentions the name of Sir Thomas Roe. These 2 incidents portray how much regard the Mughals had given to the English, a very low regard. It would take almost a century before the attention of the Mughals shifted towards the English. Until then, the English have devised certain ways to stay in touch with the Mughal emperor. And they would ensure that they would follow the Mughal court etiquette and also learn good Persian. Not only this, in time, they've also gone ahead of their rivals, the Dutch, French, and the Portuguese, in getting imperial favors from the Mughal emperor. By seeing all this, one of the historians, called Sanjay Subramaniam, had not seen the company as a corporate entity, but a Indo-Persian creature called the Company Bahadur. Bahadur means valiant in Indian language. From all the incidences that I've illustrated, it becomes evident that it was not easy for the British East India Company to be able to get their trade privileges so far, and they had to be hard earned. But nevertheless, after having spent 3 years in the court of the emperor, Sir Thomas Roe was successful in getting some trade privileges, like getting land to set up a trading station or a factory in Surat. And there were a couple of royal orders that were given so that they could be shown to the Mughal officials to carry out a hazel-free trade. So, after having spent 3 years in the court of the Emperor Jahangir, Sir Thomas Roe is successful in getting some sort of trade privileges, and then he returns to England. All the events that I described so far show that it was not easy for the British East India Company to get trading privileges from the Mughal emperor, and it had to be hard earned.